start by getting to know your target generations and their search habits and your target audience in general. Start learning about them, start talking to them, and start using this knowledge in your wider marketing and SEO strategy. Hello, I'm Izabela Janczak, and this is SEO in 2026.
Izabela, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
So my number one SEO tip is to meet each generation where they search, or even better, to meet your target generation where they search.
Okay, so how would you define a generation in this context, and how do you know where to meet them?
Obviously, I think we're all quite familiar with generations by now, because there is actually more generations, I think, than we ever had in internet searching the web. So we keep hearing about Generation Z and Millennials and Boomers and all of that. And actually, each of those generations, if we think about it, they've got their own habits of searching for information or searching for products. And to even add to this, there's not only even more generations, but we've got more platforms than ever that all of those generations can spread across and search for their information. So getting this right, especially if you're like smaller brand with a smaller budget and you can't afford to be absolutely everywhere, is a key, I think, to get your targeting right and to understand your audience.
So in terms of generations, are you talking about generations like Generation X, Millennials, Generation Zs, and cohorts like that?
I think we can start from this, but I would focus more probably on who is your target audience and how we can tie it to generational habits. They can be Generation Z and Generation X and Millennials. And I think this is a great starting point, but I would probably dive even deeper to understand how is this split, where is this split for your brand and for what you're trying to promote. But the general generations, it's a great starting point to this.
General generations.
General generations.
How do you actually figure out, define where each generation resides in terms of platform?
I think that's a great question, and I was expecting this question. I would say your first point of call is your CMS, and it's a bit easier for you if you're an e-commerce brand, because you usually get more information about your customers and you can get it quicker. Basically, if you're B2B, it might be a bit more difficult. You might need to, for example, offer something to people, or like send them an email, asking them a question and offer something to download, for example. The first point, CMS. Then obviously we've got Google Analytics with a lot of those information floating about as well. It's just a matter of finding it and using it. We've got Microsoft Clarity, another great tool. Just be mindful about third-party tools, because that's why I'm putting an emphasis on the CMS, because that's your kind of the first and most real, if I can call it this, information about your website and about your business. Because some of the third-party tools, like for example Google Analytics, have been under-reporting, I know for me and for some of my colleagues, some bits. So it might not be best to rely only on this, but it's a great way and great part, let's say, of your whole generational picture. It's definitely good to use it. It's just I wouldn't rely solely on it.
Okay, so we have to consider platforms, behaviors, and values. Are you saying that all of our content marketing, all of our SEO needs to target one specific generation?
Oh, no, definitely not. But I think we can agree that depending on your business, there might be some generations that will be more interested in it. There might be some generations that will be less interested in it. There might be businesses that will have wide spectrum of generations interested in the business and being the customers of this business. Then from here, we will have to go to on which platforms do they search, how do they search, and obviously what sort of content do they consume best. So it might end up in a way that I've got a brand and just for the sake of an example, Generation Z is interested in my brand, and Millennials are interested, and Gen X is interested. But all of them will search differently on different platforms, and they might respond best to different types of content. So that's kind of your next step. But firstly, I think understanding if it's Generation Z that you're most retargeting, or Millennials are your kind of like the biggest customer base, especially for smaller brands, as I said, with smaller budget. Because if you can be everywhere, that's great. If you've got budget for it to be everywhere, that's great. Because obviously we have to remember that first we're targeting our customers that are there already and kind of our customer base. But what we also want as marketeers, we also want to widen, and we want more people interested in our brand. But I think it's especially super important for smaller businesses that have less budget to first focus on the first target audience that we've got, and to market to them. And as I said, from having all these generations online and all those platforms online, understanding who and where they are, I think is a very important first steps to start your marketing right, basically.
Okay, so I can understand that different generations might use different platforms and that you can actually offer different messaging, different content, and different platforms depending on who is likely to be there. But obviously, you've just got the one website. So from an SEO perspective, you don't want to be building multiple pages targeting the same keyword phrase on your site. So for your website, do you just pick one generation, one cohort of people to focus your messaging on?
I think another thing that we have to understand now is, however, I don't know, bad it will sound, SEO is not on your website only anymore. SEO is not only your keywords anymore. I think I've been talking about this for a couple of last of our conversations, David, that we have to start working together as a wider marketing team. And we have to understand that there is a connection between the website and let's call it a core basic SEO with your socials, with your YouTube, with your other marketing channels. If I can give you an example, if we've got a generation that responds best to a long-term content, we can use blogs and we can write really good blogs, white papers, research papers, right? If we've got a generation that responds best to videos and longer term videos, then we can use YouTube. We can use TikTok for shorter terms of content, and we can use YouTube Shorts. So there are different platforms that we can actually optimize on. There is a YouTube SEO floating around for a while as well. We can optimize for AI now as well. So obviously we can't forget about this, about AI tools. So I wouldn't say to only focus on your website. Obviously do focus on your website, but remember about all these other platforms and on all these other tools that are there. And you can either target different generations with them. You can mix it if you strategize it smart. So there is a lot more than a website. That's what I'm trying to say, I think, these days.
So how would you summarize how different generations use search? Because obviously you have Google, you've got AI assistants now, different social platforms as well, AI mode, ChatGPT. Which generations would you say tend to focus in on a certain type of search engine, and how do they go about using that search engine?
I think, obviously, it involves a lot of research and you have to try to understand it for your own brand. But like in general terms, I think it's quite common knowledge now that older generations tend to stick with traditional search engines and with Google. Me, myself, I would say I'm a millennial, probably. I tend to stick with Google as well, but I know depending on some of my friends will already use AI search. I know the younger generations, like Generation Z, for example, they go for AI. They ask AI straight away. For me, I'll be honest, and obviously I work in marketing, it's a bit weird. Like I still have to ask Google first and then try different search engines. The younger generations also like video content a bit more than what we see with the older generations. But what you might find for your own brand and your own specific type of audience, obviously, it might be that actually, if you're, just an example, it's not a researched idea, but just as an example, if you're in more, for example, a techie space, you might find that the older generation are actually more into AI and more into kind of like pioneering the new ways of search than in a less techie, for example, industry. So it's important to focus on and to research your brand and your audience and then tie it to the generational habits. But in a general generations idea, I think that's how it looks. That the older we are, the more we tend to stick to the traditional ways, and the younger generations, they get really interested and they get really into the new ways of search.
So you say we need to understand the language, the tone, and style that our audience uses. Where do we find that data?
So as I said, your first point of call is your CMS. Then you can A/B test. You can measure kind of like conversions depending on the type of content that you're serving. You can measure engagement depending on the type of content you're serving. But another more kind of like traditional way, I would also recommend, if you obviously can do it and you've got budget to do it, try focus groups. Try actually talking to your audience. Try polls, try sending them emails. And as I said, we can send emails and ask questions and offer and to do a competition or offer something valuable for them that they will obviously make it worth their time to answer our questions. But talk to them and try to understand what resonates with your audience and then go in that direction.
And you also say what people care about matters as well. And people could care about speed, trust, community, clarity, different metrics to actually make them more likely to make a purchase. So how do you find out what is important for the particular generation that you're focusing on?
That's one. And that's, I guess, is easier to find because, again, you can ask them these questions. You can ask them anything if you just talk to them and you offer them something valuable for their time. But another aspect of kind of talking about and focusing on what your audience cares about, it's speed and the type of content and all of that we already mentioned. But it's also like a more general, bigger value. So younger generations tend to care more about like environment, and it's just like a general thought. It's not. I know that we will find people in all the generations care about that, but I know Generation Z is quite into the environment and goods environmentally friendly and all of that stuff. So it's quite a big picture. And I appreciate that there's a lot that we need to more about and we need to care about now compared to what we did like even 5 years ago when we were still more into keywords and what you mentioned, what is actually on our website. And now we've got all of that big picture that we have to focus on.
Now, you mentioned that you tend to focus on Google first of all, and perhaps certain generations just do that or just focus on other platforms. You've got big social networks like LinkedIn and TikTok. Is it right to completely ignore certain platforms, maybe certain brands to ignore ChatGPT, certain brands to ignore TikTok, if they believe that the majority of their audience aren't interacting there?
I wouldn't recommend to completely ignore. Simply because first, as I've mentioned before, we have to think about expanding as well at some point, even if it's not now, it should happen at some point, and trying to target different audiences and be in front of different audiences. Secondly, search behaviors can change. And obviously, as we can see, search behaviors are changing all the time. We've got different new platforms. Who's to say we're not going to get very great AI tool that's going to, get all the older generations like me, for example, to focus more on that search. So definitely not ignore. I would say that we should always be present. So that's what we recommend to our clients usually when some of them tend to ignore some social platforms, because you'd be like, oh, our audience is not there. That's not what we believe. It's fine. We don't have to focus on all of the social platforms, but having a presence there, just to be there, just to maybe push it later, it's quite important. So I wouldn't say ignore, but definitely, especially at the beginning, and especially if you don't have a big budget, because if you do, then great. You can focus on the ones that are most important, but still do quite a big job on the other ones. But especially if you don't have a big budget. And let's face it, obviously we've got people working with a huge brands, but there is so many small to medium brands that also need our help. And we can't use the same methods that we use for a huge brands with huge budgets. So especially for them, I think it's definitely right, and it's actually good to focus your efforts on where your audience, your target audience actually is.
Izabela, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
I would say start by getting to know your target generations and their search habits and your target audience in general. Start learning about them, start talking to them, and start using this knowledge in your wider marketing and SEO strategy.
Izabela Janczak is Head of Search Marketing at Creators Media. Find out more over at creatorsmedia.co.uk. Izabela, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Thank you.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at SEOin2026.com.